By the time she questioned why people kept pushing her limits, the pattern was already complete. She didn't remember when it started. When saying no became something she rehearsed in her mind but rarely said out loud. When her boundaries became suggestions rather than lines. When accommodating others' comfort stopped being kindness and became her default state. People tested her boundaries constantly. Not with cruelty. Not with obvious disrespect. With small asks. Can you just? Would you mind? It's not a big deal, right? And she'd say yes. Not because she wanted to, but because saying no felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. By the time she realized people tested her boundaries because she'd trained them to, the training was already embedded in who she'd become. And the system that taught her to accommodate, to yield, to prioritize others' needs over her own protection. That system had worked so slowly, so thoroughly, that questioning it felt like questioning herself. The training started early. In her family, boundaries were selfishness. Family doesn't say no to family. Why are you being so difficult? After everything we've done for you, you can't do this one thing. Every time she tried to assert a limit, the system pushed back. Not with punishment exactly. With disappointment. With guilt. With the withdrawal of warmth. And she learned, boundaries cost you love. So she stopped setting them. At school, she was praised for being flexible. Easy. Accommodating. Teachers loved her because she never complained about extra work. Friends loved her because she always said yes to plans. She became the person everyone could count on because she never counted the cost to herself. The ritual became automatic. Someone needed something? She provided it before they finished asking. Someone crossed a line? She adjusted the line to make it okay. Someone took advantage? She made excuses for why it wasn't really taking advantage. It wasn't a conscious decision anymore. It was just who she was. The girl with no boundaries. The girl who made everything easier for everyone else. And people responded to that training exactly the way you'd expect. They tested. Not maliciously. Just naturally. Because when you encounter someone with flexible boundaries, you naturally push to see where the actual limit is. When you encounter someone who always accommodates, you naturally ask for more. When you encounter someone who never pushes back, you naturally assume they don't mind. And she'd trained everyone in her life to assume she didn't mind. Through years of saying yes when she meant no. Through years of smiling when she was uncomfortable. Through years of making herself smaller so everyone else could be more comfortable. The system had taught her that her boundaries didn't matter. And once she learned that lesson deeply enough, she taught it to everyone else. There were moments when she tried to resist. Early on, before the training was complete, a friend asked to borrow money for the third time. Never paid back the first 2 loans. And something in her tightened. A small voice that said, "This isn't okay." She opened her mouth to say no, and heard herself say, "How much do you need?" Because saying no felt dangerous in a way she couldn't name. Like she'd be abandoning them. Like she'd be the bad friend. Like she'd be selfish. The discomfort of saying yes was immediate but temporary. The discomfort of saying no felt existential. So she said yes. And watched the small voice inside her get quieter. At work, her manager asked her to cover another weekend shift. The 4th one that month. She had plans. Important plans. Plans she'd been looking forward to. And that voice stirred again. You don't owe them this. She practiced saying no. Rehearsed it in the bathroom mirror. I can't this weekend. I have plans. Simple. Reasonable. Fair. But when her manager asked, what came out was, sure, no problem. Because the look on their face when she'd started to hesitate, that brief flash of disappointment, that was worse than sacrificing her weekend. The guilt of potentially letting someone down was heavier than the resentment of always giving in. A man she was dating showed up at her apartment unannounced. Late. Wanting to stay over. She was tired. Wanted to be alone. Wasn't ready for that level of access to her space. The voice was louder this time. This is a boundary. Say it. I wasn't expecting you tonight. She'd started. The boundary was forming. And he looked hurt. Confused. I thought you'd want to see me. And she crumbled. Of course I do. Come in. Because his hurt was more immediate than her discomfort. His needs were more visible than her own. And she'd learned, through years of training, that when needs conflict, Hers are the ones that yield. Each time she failed to hold a boundary, the voice got quieter. Each time she accommodated when she didn't want to, the resistance faded. Not through force, through exhaustion, through the repeated experience of trying to assert a limit and finding it too costly to maintain. And then, slowly, something shifted. The resistance stopped entirely. Not because she'd become stronger, because she'd become someone else. Someone who didn't experience boundary violations as violations anymore. Someone who'd learned to reframe every encroachment as reasonable. A coworker dumped their work on her desk with a casual, "You're so much better at this anyway." And instead of feeling used, she felt flattered, needed, important, like her lack of boundaries made her valuable. A family member showed up uninvited and stayed for hours, disrupting her entire day. And instead of feeling invaded, she felt obligated. Family is family. This is what you do. Why am I being so rigid? The man she was dating read her texts without asking, went through her phone while she was sleeping. And instead of feeling violated, she felt guilty for being upset about it. If you have nothing to hide, why does it matter? He just wants to feel close to you. Why are you making this a big deal? She'd stopped experiencing boundary violations as boundary violations because she'd normalized them through repetition, through reframing, through the gradual erosion of her own sense of what she was allowed to protect. The system had taught her that boundaries are selfishness, and she'd internalized it so completely that she policed herself now. She didn't need other people to push her limits anymore. She erased them before anyone even had to ask, "Do you mind if I?" "No, go ahead." Before they finished the sentence, before she even knew what they were asking for, because saying yes had become automatic. Not a decision, a reflex. The person she'd become didn't have boundaries to test. She had suggestions, preferences that could be overridden, soft limits that dissolved under the slightest pressure. And people responded to that exactly as you'd expect. They kept testing, not because they were cruel, but because her behavior invited it. When someone doesn't protect themselves, others stop protecting them too. When someone consistently yields, others naturally push to see how far the yielding goes. It wasn't malice. It was pattern recognition. She'd taught them through years of behavior, "My boundaries aren't real. Keep pushing. I'll accommodate." And they believed her, because she'd made herself believable. By the time she understood what had happened, she couldn't separate herself from the pattern anymore. She'd become someone who couldn't set boundaries even when she consciously wanted to. Her therapist suggested practicing. Start small. Say no to something this week. Anything. Just to practice the feeling. She tried. A friend asked if she could vent. She was exhausted, had a deadline, needed to say no. And she heard herself say, "Of course. What's going on?" Not because she wanted to, because saying no had become physically impossible. Like trying to speak a language she'd never learned. The words were there, but they wouldn't form. Her nervous system wouldn't allow it. Years of training had made boundary setting feel dangerous at a cellular level. Like touching fire. Like stepping off a cliff. Her body stopped her before her mind could even complete the thought. She tried again. Her manager asked for another weekend. She'd prepared, practiced, was determined. "I can't." Her throat closed, heart racing, hands shaking. The physical response to saying no was identical to the physical response to danger. I can. Yes, I can do it. Relief flooded through her body. The danger had passed. She'd accommodated. She was safe again. That's when she understood. This wasn't about weakness anymore. This was rewiring. Identity level change. She'd become someone who couldn't protect herself even when she wanted to. The system had taught her so thoroughly that boundaries equal abandonment, that her nervous system treated boundary setting as a survival threat. And you can't think your way out of a survival threat. You can't logic your way past a nervous system response. She'd have to rein herself. Slowly, painfully. Learn to tolerate the panic that came with saying no. Sit with the guilt that came with disappointing someone. Endure the fear that came with the possibility of being left. And unlearn, gradually, the lesson that had become her identity. That she only mattered when she was useful. That love was conditional on accommodation. That her boundaries were the price she paid for being wanted. This is why people test your boundaries. Not because they're bad people. Not because they're trying to hurt you. But because you taught them to. Through behavior. Through pattern. Through the systematic erosion of your own limits. The system that creates boundaryless people starts young. Families that punish autonomy. Schools that reward compliance. Cultures that equate boundaries with selfishness. And it works through repetition. Each time you're made to feel guilty for saying no. Each time you're punished for asserting a limit. Each time you're rewarded for sacrificing yourself. The lesson embeds deeper. Until it's not a lesson anymore. It's who you are. And once you've become someone without boundaries, you don't need external enforcement anymore. You police yourself. You stop yourself from saying no before anyone even has to ask you to give in. You apologize for wanting things. For taking up space. For having needs. You become the system's perfect product, someone who voluntarily erases themselves. And people around you respond to that. They test. They push. They take. Not because they're exploitative, but because your behavior tells them it's allowed. When you don't protect your boundaries, no one else will either. When you teach people that your limits are negotiable, they'll negotiate. When you demonstrate through years of accommodation that you'll always yield eventually, they'll keep pushing until you do. This is the dark truth about boundaries. They're not respected because they're moral. They're respected because they're enforced. And if you can't enforce them, if your nervous system won't allow you to say no, then they're not boundaries at all. They are wishes, hopes, suggestions that dissolve under pressure. The person you've become, the one who can't say no, who accommodates automatically, who feels guilty for having limits. That person wasn't born. They were created by a system that needed you to be boundaryless, by people who benefited from your flexibility, by years of training that taught you your boundaries don't matter as much as others' comfort. And now that identity is self-policing, you don't need anyone to tell you to accommodate anymore. You do it reflexively, automatically. You've become the system's agent, enforcing its rules on yourself, and breaking free of that, reclaiming your right to have boundaries. That's not about learning to say no. It's about unlearning the belief that saying no makes you unlovable. It's about retraining a nervous system that treats self-protection as danger. It's about slowly, painfully becoming someone who can tolerate being disliked, disappointing people, losing relationships that were never sustainable anyway. People test your boundaries because you taught them they could. And they'll keep testing until you teach them something different. Not with words. With behavior. By holding the line even when it's uncomfortable. By saying no even when it feels like dying. By choosing yourself even when it means losing people who only valued you for your compliance. The system taught you who to be. Now you have to teach yourself who you actually are underneath all that training. Someone with boundaries. With limits. With the right to take up space. It won't feel natural. It'll feel like betrayal at first. But that discomfort is the sound of the old identity dying. And something real being born in its place.